المرسلين وعلى آله وصحابته أجمعين أما بعد. So, alhamdulillah, we are continuing with the discussion concerning the beginning of the establishment of the newly formed Islamic State, the first of its kind. After the hijrah of Rasul ﷺ and before him, his companions, and ultimately Rasul ﷺ performs his hijrah, and we talked a little bit about the background of Medina and the difference between Makkah and Medina, quite a big difference, even though they were both in the Arabian Peninsula, not in very far proximity, but there was quite considerable difference. And the fact that the first major project of Rasulullah was to establish the masjid, the spiritual, the political, the economical, the judicial center of Medina and the state, and everything was going on in the masjid, and the environment that was established in that masjid, and that as we might call it, contagious environment. Anyone who came there was totally transformed. And we talked about, we mentioned the story of Thumama ibn Uthad, the chieftain from Bani Hanifa, who was transformed with 3 days being tied up in the masjid. So they didn't even have a prison. The prison was also the masjid. It was the center of all activities. So now Rasulullah comes to Medina, and as we mentioned earlier, there was several major issues that had to be contended with. Number one was the issue of the Ansar of Medina, which comprised of the two major tribes of Aus and Khazraj, which were warring tribes, and they had long-standing enmity and long-standing wars. Recently, just prior to that, the Battle of Bu'ath, in which many of them were killed and no resolution really took place, so that those wounds were still festering. Now, with the coming of Rasulullah, the first major social sort of engineering that needed to take place was to combine these tribes into one body of Islam, one body of Islamic brotherhood. That was on the one side. On the other side, the Muhajirin coming from Makkah, binding and creating a synergy and a brotherhood between them also and the Ansar. Because the Ansar, after all, they are both from Medina, and these are the Muhajirin from Makkah, and they've left everything. They came to, and they've now come to Medina. So now, Nabi Wasallam instituted what we call mu'akhat, making them an actual brotherhood. Perhaps we alluded to that or mentioned that previously. So they were made a brother. One Muhajir would be made a brother with one Ansari. And we have amazing stories of that. Sa'd ibn Rabi'a, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, the Ansari, was made the brother of Abdurrahman bin Auf, who was a very successful and wealthy businessman from Makkah. Now he's left everything. He's come to Medina with nothing except the clothes on his back. So now Sa'd, and Nabi Sallallahu being very socially aware, so he would pair people with, by munasabah, by appropriateness. And so, Abdurrahman was a very high-standing person, both within the tribe and economically. So he paired him with somebody similar. So Sa'd ibn Rabi'a was quite a wealthy man, and he had two wives. So he told Abdurrahman, look, I'm very wealthy, half of my wealth is yours. We're brothers, right? So half of my wealth is now yours. I have two wives, so see which one you like. I'll divorce her, and after her death, and then you marry her. Now, whether she was also happy about that or not, I don't know. But that was the spirit of the Sahaba in those days. That's they were, for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all out. As they say, all in investment terms. So, Abdurrahman, now, if you and I, we would have said, well, that's wonderful. Thank you very much, But on the one hand, generosity, on the other hand, iffa, chastity and modesty. So So Abdurrahman, being of the honorable standing that he was, he said, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put barakat in your wealth and in your family. Just show me where's the market. I'm a businessman. So he pointed him to the market of Qaynuqa, which was the Jewish market. So after a few days, Rasul alayhi salatu wasalam, after Salat al-Fajr, notices that Abdurrahman has some yellow sort of coloring, that is sort of, affected his clothing, some yellow. And this is the kind of yellow clothing that usually is used in wedding celebrations, the za'afran and the wars and these kind of things that they used to use. So Nabi Sallallahu saw this, he said, Abdurrahman, what's that? He said, Ya Rasulullah, I just got married to one Ansari lady. Which is very interesting. So he was offered, he went to the market, and what he did, he started buying things, and he had no money. So this is also, what acumen they had. He would buy something, perhaps on credit, and then sell it, and then pay it off, and just, move around like this. And in a few days, he was able to actually, find his own way in marriage, and he married some woman. And very interestingly, quite different from our tradition. Before the marriage, 6 months, cards are sent out here, and the marriage is in Los Angeles, and people have to come from Alaska and Hawaii and Pakistan and the North Pole, and I don't know where, and huge amounts of resources are just squandered away for the sake of something which doesn't need except the people who are there. That's all. That's how marriage, was. So it's very, very interesting that Abdurrahman also, by the way, was one of the very earliest of the Muslims from Mecca. One of the very first people whom Abu Bakr gave dawah and immediately, from the very beginning. And how close he was to Rasulullah. And even so, he didn't even invite Rasulullah to, attend my wedding. That's how simple an affair it was. It's a very natural, very simple affair. Anyway, so then Rasulullah said, oh, is that right? So did you, Mada suqta laha? And so what did you give her as mahar? He said, I gave her a little piece of gold about the size of a date seed. That was it. Right? So anyway, the point is that the simplicity of their life and the spirit of sacrifice, both from the Ansar and the Muhajirin. The Ansar are ready to give everything. Muhajirin, they want nothing from anyone except Allah, and they don't want to give trouble and difficulties to anyone. So now, the issue of joining the Ansar, getting them to, forgive and forget and just take that previous animosity out of their minds, and then also join the Ansar with the Muhajirin, and those were the two camps, Muhajirin and Ansar, the two, the two synergizing elements, even though they continue to remain known as Muhajirin and Ansar, and even they're mentioned in the Quran. So these were not opposing, but they were a synergy of people who migrate and those who help them. And through the synergy of that migration and that helping of the migrants came this, this amazing energy in the new Islamic society. So that's the one thing. The other thing that they had that was very significant was we didn't have only the Arabs there. We had the Jewish community, and they had a very peculiar juxtapositioning. And so they had to be, dealt with. And how do we deal with that? Because they are living within the precincts of Medina as well. And also we had a third contingent were the Arabs who had not yet accepted Islam, which were quite a few from the Aus and Khazraj. Some of them had accepted Islam, some didn't. However, it was quite different from Mecca in that there wasn't that severe animosity between those who accepted Islam and didn't. Those who accepted, fine. Those who didn't, they were standing in the back sort of watching. Plus, you had the Arab tribes, the Bedouin tribes around Medina, who were also observing what's going on here. And the Arab and the Bedouins, they just sort of flow with the wind. So whoever, in supremacy is in power, they'll go along with that. And at this point in time, Quraysh are the people who are still, wielding the clout and are, basically recognized as the top, the top dogs in the political strata or in the landscape in Arabia. So Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam now drew up what is the first constitution definitely the first constitution of any written type of constitution that ever took place in Arabia, and probably unique in its subject matter, perhaps in constitutions in general, and that was codifying and also specifying all the various connections between the tribes, their responsibilities, between the Muhajirin and the Ansar and the various tribes and their allies, and the Jews and their rights, and the fact that all of the tribes and the Jewish people and everyone who comes into an allegiance with the state, the new Islamic state in Medina, they all are to be protected, they all are to cooperate with one another, they're all to be sincere with one another. And of course, there cannot be any room for any sort of treasonous type of activities, and these things are all stated very, it's still preserved, that original constitution that was written up, and it was signed by all parties. And this we have to keep in mind, because later on, when the Jews are now driven out of Arabia, the reason being is because they broke this very truce. To this very day, Jewish scholars and historians, they try and put an onus on Islam and on Muslims, and how did you do this to the Jewish tribes? And so, because the fact is that they came into a pact. This was high treason that they committed, which we'll see later down the road. In any case, at that point, they all came together and they all signed that treaty, and now Nabi ﷺ had actually, at least theoretically, came to a pactual or a sort of a constitutional agreement among all the various factors, not only the Muslims and the Jews, but also the Arabs who had not yet accepted Islam. So Nabi ﷺ had brought everybody into the auspice of that constitution, which was a very novel thing to do. So it shows that Nabi ﷺ was not simply a spiritual guide. He was a leader in a holistic sense, in all senses of the terms. So now, having done that, realizing that now we've come up and we've set up, our new state here in Medina, and Quraysh now, who had traditionally been for centuries, the rulers of the Arabian horizon, and now their position is threatened, and we already know the animosity that was displayed back in Mecca. So they're not going to sit by just watching this happen and not take a stand and not try and eliminate this competition. So knowing full well, Nabi ﷺ, that this is on the horizon, this is in the immediate future, and we need to take preparations accordingly. So immediately as well, he began to develop his military strength. And it was also of good circumstances that, of course, the Muhajirin who came from Makkah, the Quraysh had been, in constant wars also with various tribes. So the Muhajirin were quite, trained in the arts of fighting, and the Ansar, with their wars among themselves for millennia, they also were very good fighters as well. So now Nabi ﷺ began to, get his military strength consolidated, and now begin, because on the one hand we have to keep things together inside Medina and keep this pact intact, and keep people moving along with it, and we have contingents who are willingly, and we have contingents which are not very willingly, like the Jews and the Arabs, who out of circumstances they have really no other choice. So if we have a strong military presence, it's going to have two effects. One, that the people internally in Medina are going to, keep on track. At the same time, those Bedouin tribes who are always, causing trouble from time to time generally, they would also realize that no, there's a force to be reckoned with there in Medina. At the same time, Quraysh, if they become aware of the fact that yes, they do have very strong military capacity, it's going to deter them from just blatantly and with impunity make an attempt to wipe out Islam. So now Nabi ﷺ starts his military campaigns. Also noteworthy is that in Mecca, the order was kuffu aydiyakum. In other words, keep your hands down, no retaliation. We're not allowed to fight. We're not even allowed to defend ourselves. in Makkah. And there's various, there are various good reasons. Of course, that's the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there's good reason for that. Obviously, if they would have began fighting and retaliating, it would have been very disastrous in many ways. However, before Hijrat, just before Hijrat, the order from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes that those people who have been wronged and tyrannized and have been accosted, by the Quraysh and by the disbelievers, they have the right to defend themselves. And so this verse was revealed just before the Hijrah. However, it was not acted upon until after reaching Medina. So now, with permission and perhaps the hikmah of sending down that revelation before Hijrah is to give the sort of announcement that it's time to now prepare for these eventualities and get our military strength together. So Nabi ﷺ started sending out small bands, which are known as saraya, which is the plural of sariya, which in the technical terms of seerah, we call a sariya an expedition in which the Prophet ﷺ himself was not present, and we call a ghazwa the expedition which the Prophet ﷺ himself was there. Otherwise, a sariya is generally considered linguistically a small band of a military band was sent out for a particular mission. So the first of those such missions was sent out about 6 months after the arrival of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam to Medina, and that was led by Sayyidina Hamza radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And they actually were headed towards the coast in pursuit of a caravan, which was headed by Abu Jahl, and there were 30 individuals, and that caravan had 300 individuals. However, when they reached nearby there, a truce was sort of established due to the sort of intervention of one of the tribal chiefs known as Majd ibn Amr from Juhayna. And so there wasn't any battle, there was a truce, and the Muslims went back to Medina. About a month later in Shawwal, the Prophet's second cousin, you could say, Sayyidina Ubaidah ibn al-Harith, who is going to be one of the first martyrs in Islam, as he was martyred in Badr, and we'll see that in the next chapter, inshallah. So he was sent with the second contingent, the second city, with about 60 men. They were headed towards Rabiq, and they met at a place called Ahya, which is a spring, which is a well. And there Abu Sufyan was leading a caravan of the Quraysh of 200 people. And here actually a skirmish took place. And it was there that Abu Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas shot the first arrow in Islam. And he mentions this also in various hadiths that later on during the time of Umar, when he was sent to Kufa to be the governor, the people of Kufa didn't like him because he was too strict on them. So they made all these, false allegations. He said, and he mentioned defending himself, which he didn't need because Umar knew very well who he was and what he was. But in any case, he mentioned this, that I was the one who shot the first arrow in Islam, and that's when it took place, was in this Sariya of Ahya. However, there wasn't much more fighting that took place, and that was the end of that. A few weeks later in Dhul Qa'dah, then again Sa'd ibn Waqqas takes another contingent of 20 people on foot. And they reached to a place called Al-Kharrar, and they were also in pursuit, and they went on foot to be unnoticed, taking, sort of a shelter, and taking, hiding in the day and so forth. They didn't want to be seen, and therefore they went on foot. However, the Quraysh caravan had already slipped past and gotten away from them, and they were a day's journey away. It was impossible to catch them, so they also went back to Medina. Thereafter, Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam, 3 months later in Safar, the Prophet himself proceeded in the next expedition, which would be known as a ghazwa in that case, and that's known as a ghazwa Baddan. And there wasn't fighting, but a very important thing took place, and that was that the tribe of Damra came into alliance. So now we're starting to get alliances of the tribes, along with Medina, which is a very important political strategy. And at the same time, Abu Salama, who was the husband of Salama, who was later passed away, and then of course she became the wife of Rasulullah, and who both of them were the very early Muslims, and who had also gone to Ethiopia, as we heard earlier, he was kept as the deputy, and he was kept as the person to look after Medina. So that is also developing. When the Prophet ﷺ goes and he leaves Medina, there's a system and a structure for keeping things intact, and he had a sort of niyabat, as it were, was established as well. Then very interestingly, there was a fellow by the name of Kurz ibn Jabir al-Fihri, who was from the Bedouin tribes, and as was the want, as we mentioned, they attacked, not they actually Medina, but they attacked some of the pastures and took some of the camels and some of the animals of the Muslims and took off. So they escaped. A contingent went after them. But this same Kurz ibn Jabir later on actually accepts Islam, and he himself leads an expedition. And after the Urayna and Uqal, a group who came to Medina, and Nabi ﷺ sent them to the pastures of the camels of Sadaqah, so that they could drink from the milk of those camels and regain their health. So rather than regaining their health and being grateful, they killed the shepherd of Rasulullah ﷺ looking after those camels, and took all those camels and fled. And so it was Kurz ibn Jabir who went after them and caught them, and they were brought back and they were dealt with severely. So now these small skirmishes are going out. So sometimes there's light battles, sometimes there's light skirmishes, and sometimes actual alliances are developed with these various Arab tribes, which is a very important political move as well. Now a very important incident takes place shortly thereafter, and that was another expedition was sent by Rasulullah of Abdullah ibn Jahsh, who was Zainab binti Jahsh, the wife of Rasulullah, her brother. So he was sent with a contingent, and this is a very unique, that he was sent with instructions not to be read until 2 days later in the journey. And when 2 days has passed, you open up the instructions and then follow them. So this was Nabi Sallallahu keeping the amour, the affairs in secrecy. So anyway, so they continue for 2 days in the direction that Nabi Sallallahu sent them. They open the letter, and the instructions is that they are to proceed to a place called Nakhla, which is the place, if you remember, we talked about that earlier, was the place when Nabi Sallallahu when he came from Taif, and he was coming back from Medina and having been stoned and expelled and very frustrated. So that was the place where the jinn from Yemen, or possibly from Syria, whatever the case was, two things are mentioned. Those jinn actually accepted Islam. In any case, they are now being sent to that place, which is between Taif and Mecca, and that's very close to Mecca, and that's quite a distance from Medina, and this is quite a difficult task. So this is like the Mission Impossible kind of a thing. And the idea is to go there and see. It was a kind of reconnaissance journey, and sort of an intelligence operation to find out what's going on in Mecca and how Quraysh are dealing with the new situation. Are they preparing for war? What are they planning on doing? So when he opened up that letter from Rasulullah, so in that letter the instructions was that anyone who wants to remain, because this is going to be a very dangerous mission, obviously, and it's very possible people are going to lose their lives, and they're a very small amount of people, and they're very far from Medina and very close to Makkah. So the instructions are read to them that this is where you're headed. Anyone who feels that this is too much, wants to head back to Medina, welcome. Anyone who wants to remain and continue with Abdullah, then also welcome. And all of them, of course, they said, we're ready, and they took off. Now what happened is that Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas and Uqba ibn Ghazwan, two of the members of that expedition, their camel took off. And also in that expedition they had one camel for two people. So their camel escaped. So they went off looking for their camel. In the meantime, the rest of the contingent went off. And this is significant because it comes to play later on. So now when they get close to Mecca, there was a group of Meccans who were traveling, and they saw these people. They saw these people from Medina, and they thought, what's going on here? So, very amazingly, Ukash ibn Muhsin, very, he's the one that mentioned that Nabi Alayhi Sallam said there's 70,000 people who are going into Jannah without hisab and without adab. So this Ukasha, he stood up and said, Ya Rasulullah, pray for me that I should be among them. He said, you're from among them. So another fellow stood up, said, pray for me. He said, Ukasha beat you to the punch. It's only for Ukasha. So this same Ukasha ibn Muhsin, seeing this, that we've been seen, so now he shaves his head and he acts as though, or he sort of puts on the, finds the appearance that he's actually in the state of ihram and he's going to perform umrah. Which is a very, that's something you might see in a movie, or something like that. They're really a tricky move. So then the Makkans see that, these are just people who are actually coming for umrah, so no need to worry about them. Right? So that fooled them. Now, it also happens to be Rajab, the same month that we're in now, which is one of these sacred months. And the sacred months, as we mentioned earlier, are months in which there's no qital, there's no fighting. And the Arabs, even with their polytheism and all of their other nonsense that they were into, but they used to, regard these months. They would not actually, accost anyone. So that's the last day of Rajab. Now, if we let these guys go away, we're never going to get this chance again. This is a caravan, we can attack them and we can have that spoils and that booty. But then again, it's the last day of the Muharram month. So what do we do? Well, they decided to attack, and they did. And 2 prisoners were taken. One of the Muslims was killed. Waqid ibn Abdullah was killed Amr ibn al-Hadrami. And 2 prisoners were taken, Uthman ibn Abdullah and al-Hakam ibn Kaysan. So now they get back to Medina, and now Nabi Sallallahu is not happy at all about this. We have enough, bad publicity as it is, and now you've killed, you killed somebody and you attacked a caravan in the month of Muharram, in a haram month. So Nabi Sallallahu didn't accept these prisoners, and he wouldn't accept, the bounty. And this really, put this group into a really, really bad place. And of course, they must have been, really, really frustrated and really, really, dejected as well. However, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down Quran that relieved and diffused the whole situation. And He mentioned, يَسَأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الشَّهْرِ الْحَرَامِ قِتَالٍ فِيهِ. So they ask you about, and the Quraysh, they said, hey, what is this, Muhammad? You are talking about, holding up the rights and observing what is sacred, and you attack us during the month of Haram month. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends down the reply that they ask you about the months of Haram, or the sacred months, fighting therein. Say, yes, it's a big deal. It's something that should not be done. But kufrun billah, disbelief in Allah and in the Masjid al-Haram, and sending the people out of it, that's bigger. But fitna to ashaddu min al-qatl, and such kind of fitna and such type of travesty is much worse than the qital. And so that sort of abrogated that whole concept. If they're attacking you in the month of Haram, then you are free to accost them. So that principle was established, and they were venerated, and of course that was a very big turning point. It also showed Quraysh that the Muslims were a force to be reckoned with, and it also, with all these expeditions, quite a good amount of information has now been processed, and now the topography, the geography, and the political situation and what's going on also becomes much more clear there in Medina Munawwara. And inshallah we'll continue with this in our next sitting. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Subhanahu wa bihamdika nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.